There comes a quiet moment in life when you begin to understand something that nobody ever warned you about. It doesn't arrive dramatically. It doesn't come with a loud argument or a painful confrontation. Instead, it arrives slowly, almost gently, like the realization that the world you once stood at the center of has quietly moved on without you. My name is Edward. I'm 82 years old now, and the truth I'm about to share is something I learned much later than I wish I had. After 60, your family may not always be there the way you once imagined they would be. Not because they stopped loving you, not because they became selfish people, but because life pulls them in directions that no longer revolve around you. And if you keep waiting for them to fill every empty space in your life, those spaces only grow larger. For most of my life, I believed family was the answer to everything. I had a wife named Clara, 3 wonderful children, and a house that never seemed quiet. There was always noise somewhere. Someone laughing in the kitchen, someone running through the hallway, someone calling my name from another room asking for help with homework, money, advice, or a ride across town. Back then I was the person everyone depended on. I fixed broken sinks, solved problems, settled arguments, and drove wherever someone needed to go. It felt natural, like the center of gravity in our family. And for decades I never questioned whether that position might one day change. Then Clara passed away. The first few months after losing her were filled with kindness. My children called every day. They visited often, sometimes bringing food, sometimes simply sitting with me in the living room while we talked about nothing in particular. At the time I believed that this would simply be the new shape of my life. Clara was gone, yes, but the children would now step closer into the empty space she left behind. I thought that was how families worked. You lose one pillar and the others move in to hold the roof up. But life doesn't freeze just because someone you love disappears. Little by little, the rhythm changed. The daily phone calls became every other day. Then a few times a week. The visits that once happened every Sunday slowly stretched further apart. At first I told myself everyone was just busy for a little while. My daughter Rachel had work deadlines. My son Daniel was dealing with repairs on his house. My youngest, Laura, had teenagers at home, and teenagers bring chaos everywhere they go. Weeks passed and I kept waiting for the old pattern to return. But it never did. One evening I noticed something that startled me. I had gone 3 full days without speaking to another human being. The house felt different when I realized it. Larger, quieter. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears until you turn on the television just to prove the world still exists. I picked up the phone that night and thought about calling Rachel. Then I hesitated. I didn't want to be the father who constantly needed attention. I didn't want to sound lonely, even though loneliness was exactly what I was feeling. That night became the beginning of the first lesson that changed my life. The first principle is simple to say, but incredibly difficult to accept. Stop waiting for someone to save you. For a long time I believed my children would eventually notice how empty my days had become. I imagined that one of them would call and suggest I move closer, or perhaps invite me to stay with them for a while, or somehow reorganize their lives so that I would no longer feel so alone. But the truth is that everyone around me was already carrying their own responsibilities. Jobs, marriages, mortgages, raising children, caring for aging in-laws. Their lives were already full. And expecting them to rearrange those lives to fix my loneliness was unfair to them and damaging to me. Once that realization settled in, something unexpected happened. The waiting stopped. When you stop waiting, you start moving again. The days that once felt like long empty hallways suddenly began to feel like open space that I could shape however I wanted. I started taking morning walks simply because there was no reason not to. I began reading again, not the quick newspaper glances I used to do while rushing to work, but real reading, the kind where you sit with a book and let time disappear. Nothing dramatic happened overnight. But slowly the feeling of helplessness began to fade. I understood that if my life was going to feel meaningful again, the responsibility for building that life belonged to me. The second principle grew out of the quiet that filled my house during those early months. Learn to be comfortable being alone. This might sound like an obvious skill, but for many people my age it is something we never had to practice. I married Clara when I was 23 years old. Before that I had roommates, college friends, co-workers, and family around me constantly. In more than 6 decades I had almost never experienced true solitude. Suddenly the house held only one voice, one set of footsteps, one person sitting at the dinner table. At first I tried to escape that silence. The television was always on. Even when I wasn't watching it. The radio played while I made coffee. I called relatives just to hear another voice for a few minutes. I filled every quiet corner with noise because silence felt like proof that something was missing. Then one evening a storm rolled through town and knocked the power out across the neighborhood. No television. No radio. No lights humming in the background. Just the sound of rain hitting the roof and wind moving through the trees outside. I sat in the living room for a long time with nothing but that quiet around me. At first it felt uncomfortable, almost like being trapped in a room with a stranger. But after an hour something changed. The silence stopped feeling threatening. It started feeling peaceful. I noticed small things that I had ignored for years. The rhythm of the rain against the windows. The creak of the old wooden floorboards as the house settled. Even my own breathing seemed louder, steadier, calmer than I expected. That night I realized something important. Being alone was not the same thing as being abandoned. It simply meant that for the moment, my own company was the only company available. So I began practicing solitude the same way someone practices a new habit. Some mornings I would sit quietly with my coffee instead of turning on the television. Some afternoons I would walk through the park without headphones or distractions, just watching people pass by and listening to the wind moving through the trees. Gradually the silence became familiar instead of frightening. The third principle appeared when I finally looked honestly at something many people my age try very hard to ignore. Your identity cannot remain only a parent. For decades the most important word used to describe me was father. Every decision, every schedule, every plan in my life revolved around that role. I worked long hours so my children could attend good schools. I skipped vacations so they could join sports teams or music lessons. I remember countless evenings sitting at the kitchen table helping with homework while Clara prepared dinner nearby. Being a father was not just a responsibility. It was my entire identity. But identities built around other people eventually change when those people grow up. One afternoon I visited Rachel's house with a container of soup I had made earlier that day. I imagined she might appreciate the help. She greeted me kindly, but I noticed something in her expression. Not irritation exactly, but a polite patience. She was juggling a phone call, 2 teenagers arguing about something upstairs, and a work email flashing on her laptop screen. She didn't need a parent stepping in to solve problems anymore. She was already doing that herself. Driving home that day, I realized that continuing to define myself only as a father was quietly keeping me stuck in the past. My children were adults with their own homes, careers, and families. They needed love and encouragement from me, but they no longer needed constant guidance. So I began asking a question that had never occurred to me before. Who is Edward when he is not busy being someone's father? The answer didn't arrive quickly, but that question started a journey that changed everything that followed. The strange thing about asking a question like that late in life is that it feels both exciting and uncomfortable at the same time. For decades, every decision I made had a clear direction. It was always about what my family needed. Now the path in front of me was wider, but also unfamiliar. I began to realize that discovering who I was outside the role of father would take patience, curiosity, and a willingness to let life look different from what I had always known. That realization naturally led me to the fourth principle, one that many people my age resist because it touches on pride as much as reality. Your children do not owe you their lives. That sentence can sound harsh at first. When you spend 30 or 40 years sacrificing time, money, and energy raising children, it's easy to believe that someday those sacrifices will circle back. Not in a selfish way, but in a quiet expectation that when you become older and slower, your children will step in and carry some of the weight you once carried for them. I used to think that way too. I remembered the years of overtime, the weekends spent fixing bicycles and building school projects, the times Clara and I postponed our own dreams because tuition bills or medical expenses came first. Those memories created a feeling deep inside that somehow, eventually, life would balance the scales. But life rarely works like a ledger. One evening Rachel mentioned a difficult situation she had faced at work a few weeks earlier. Her company had gone through a sudden reorganization, and she spent several stressful days worrying about whether she would lose her position. When she described the experience, she talked about the long conversations she had with her husband and a close friend who worked in the same industry. She talked about the advice they gave her, the encouragement they offered, the late-night phone calls that helped her stay calm during the uncertainty. As I listened, I realized something quietly important. She had not called me during that time. Years earlier, that realization might have hurt deeply. I might have wondered why my daughter didn't think of me first when she needed support. But sitting there at the kitchen table, watching the confidence in her voice and the strength she carried through that difficult moment, I understood something I had overlooked for too long. My children had built lives that extended far beyond the family home they grew up in. They had partners, colleagues, friends, and communities of their own. That network was not replacing me. It was simply the natural result of the independence Clara and I had spent decades encouraging. You cannot spend your entire life teaching your children to stand on their own feet and then feel betrayed when they actually do. Letting go of the belief that my children owed me their time or constant attention lifted a surprising weight from my shoulders. It removed the quiet resentment that sometimes builds when expectations remain unspoken. Instead of keeping score of how often they visited or called, I began appreciating the moments we did share. A lunch together every few weeks. A conversation about their work or their children. Those moments felt lighter because they were no longer tied to invisible obligations. Around that same time, another reality began to reveal itself, leading me to the fifth principle. Accept the limits that come with age. Growing older has a way of humbling even the most capable people. For most of my life I prided myself on being dependable. If something broke, I fixed it. If someone needed help moving furniture, I was the first person lifting the heavy end of the couch. That image of myself as the reliable problem solver stayed with me long after my body began quietly sending different messages. One night close to midnight my son Daniel called. His car had broken down on a highway about an hour away from my house. Years earlier I would have grabbed my keys immediately, driven through the dark, and brought him home without a second thought. But that night I paused. Driving long distances after dark had become difficult for me. My eyesight wasn't what it used to be, and the glare of headlights from oncoming traffic often blurred my vision. For a moment I considered ignoring that reality. Pride has a powerful voice. It whispers that admitting weakness somehow diminishes who you are. But another voice, quieter and wiser, reminded me that pretending to be capable of things I could no longer do would only create danger for both of us. So I told him the truth. I explained that night driving had become difficult for me and suggested he call a roadside service or a friend closer to where he was. There was a brief silence on the phone, the kind of pause that often follows unexpected honesty. Then Daniel simply said he understood and that he would figure something out. After the call ended, I sat in my chair for a long time thinking about what had just happened. Part of me felt guilty, as if I had failed him. But another part recognized something important. Accepting limitations is not the same as abandoning responsibility. It is simply acknowledging reality. The next time my children visited, I gently explained that certain things had become harder for me. Long drives late at night, lifting heavy objects, climbing ladders to repair things around the house. I told them I would always listen, always care, always support them emotionally, but some physical tasks might need to be handled by someone else. To my surprise, the conversation felt relieving rather than uncomfortable. My children didn't look disappointed. In fact, they seemed grateful for the honesty. They began adjusting their expectations naturally, just as I was adjusting my understanding of what aging truly meant. That shift in honesty opened the door to the final principle, perhaps the most powerful lesson of all. Build a life outside your family. For most of my adult life, my entire social world revolved around my wife and children. We attended school events, family gatherings, holiday celebrations, and the occasional neighborhood barbecue. But true friendships outside the family circle were rare. When Clara was alive, that never felt like a problem. Our home was full of activity and conversation. After she passed away, that narrow social world became painfully obvious. One morning during my usual walk through the neighborhood, I noticed a woman watering flowers in the yard next door. Her name was Linda, someone I had waved to occasionally over the years without ever really speaking. That morning we exchanged a few words about the weather, nothing significant. But the next time we saw each other, we talked a little longer. Eventually she mentioned that she often walked in the nearby park during the early mornings and suggested I join her sometime. The first walk felt slightly awkward, like two strangers trying to decide what topics were safe to discuss. But conversation became easier with each meeting. She told me about her job at the local library and the challenges of raising a teenage son on her own. I shared stories about my children and the years Clara and I spent building our life together. Over time, those walks became part of my weekly routine. Through Linda, I met a small group of people who gathered at the community center twice a week for morning walks. I remember hesitating before attending the first time, imagining a group of strangers who might not have much in common with me. Instead, I found something very different. The group included teachers, retired mechanics, a former nurse, and even a man who had once owned a bakery downtown. Each person carried a lifetime of stories, struggles, and small victories. We walked, talked, laughed, and occasionally shared coffee afterward. What surprised me most was the feeling of being chosen. Family connections are powerful, but they are also automatic. Friendship works differently. People spend time with you because they enjoy your company, because they appreciate who you are in the present moment rather than who you used to be. That distinction changed the way I saw my life. My relationship with my children didn't disappear. In fact, it improved in ways I hadn't expected. Without the silent pressure of needing them to fill every emotional space in my life, our conversations became easier. When Rachel visited, we talked about books she was reading or places she hoped to travel. When Daniel stopped by, we discussed small projects he was working on around his house. Our time together felt lighter because it was built on affection rather than dependency. One afternoon, Rachel looked around my living room and noticed a stack of books on the coffee table along with a pair of walking shoes by the door. She mentioned that I seemed happier than I had been during the first year after Clara passed away. Hearing that observation made me realize how far things had changed. The loneliness that once felt overwhelming had slowly transformed into something else. Not constant happiness, because life rarely works that way, but a quiet sense of stability. My days had rhythm again. Morning walks, occasional lunches with friends, time spent reading, phone calls with my children that felt natural instead of necessary. Looking back now, the truth that once sounded frightening no longer feels so heavy. Family will sometimes fail to meet the expectations we quietly carry into old age. Not because love disappears, but because life keeps moving forward for everyone. Understanding that reality does not mean giving up on family. It simply means learning how to build a life strong enough to stand even when the people we love are busy living their own. And strangely enough, once you stop waiting for others to hold you up, you often discover that you have been capable of standing on your own all along.